The Chardonnay was bland, the conversation blander. Zola Adebayo swirled the pale liquid in her glass, watching the condensation trail down the side like a single, slow tear. Across the table, David prattled on about quarterly reports, his tie slightly askew, his enthusiasm for amortization schedules profoundly misplaced. He was nice. That was the word everyone used for him. Nice. Safe. A man whose greatest emotional betrayal would be forgetting to record her favorite show. And she was so bored. It was a deep, soul-aching boredom that felt like a failure. This was her life now, the one she had meticulously built in the 5 years since the world had shattered. A life of nice apartments, nice jobs, and nice men. A fortress of pleasantries designed to keep the ghosts out. But ghosts, she was learning, were not deterred by beige walls and predictable dinner dates. Her mind drifted, as it often did, to a pair of eyes as dark and sharp as obsidian, to a silence that spoke more than David's endless monologue ever could. She felt a familiar pang, a phantom limb of a memory, and forced it down with a sip of the mediocre wine. That's when she felt it. A shift in the restaurant's low hum. A sudden drop in atmospheric pressure, as if a storm had just rolled in off the street. Heads turned, conversations faltered. A waiter, mid-pour, froze. Zola's heart didn't just beat. It slammed against her ribs, a frantic prisoner rattling its cage. She knew that presence. She knew it in her bones, in the marrow of her memory. She didn't have to look. She refused to. But her eyes betrayed her, lifting slowly, inevitably, toward the source of the disturbance. And there he was, Jin-Woo Kwon. He looked no different, and yet entirely changed. The same severe, beautiful face, the same immaculate black suit that seemed molded to his frame. But there was a harshness in the lines around his eyes that wasn't there before, a tension in his jaw that spoke of sleepless nights and unrelenting control. He moved through the restaurant, not like a patron, but like an owner, his gaze fixed, unwavering, on her table, on David. Time seemed to warp, stretching and compressing as he closed the distance. Each step was a deliberate, silent thunderclap in the sudden quiet of the room. He didn't stop beside the table. He stopped directly behind David's chair, his shadow falling over them both like a final judgment. Jin-Woo Kwon felt the familiar, cold control settle over him as he walked through the door, but it was a thin sheet of ice over a raging sea. He had seen her through the rain-slicked window, a portrait of agonizing normalcy. Her head was tilted, a polite, vacant smile on her lips as the man across from her spoke. The sight of it, of her trying to be ordinary with an ordinary man, had been a physical blow. A dull, foolish man who couldn't see the universe of fire and pain and strength that resided behind her eyes. For 5 years he had watched from a distance. He had ensured her safety, cleared obstacles from her path she never knew existed, all while honoring the brutal choice he had made, the choice to cut her out of his life, to sever the only part of himself that was not steeped in darkness and violence. He had told himself it was for her, a necessary sacrifice. But seeing her there, across from that man, he knew it for the lie it was. It was cowardice, dressed up as nobility. The urge to act was not a thought, but a primal, irresistible command. His body moved before his mind could object. The restaurant noise faded to a distant buzz. The only sound was the frantic, desperate beat of his own heart, a rhythm he thought he'd forgotten. He felt the weight of a dozen gazes on him, but they were nothing, less than nothing. There was only Zola. Her eyes, wide and luminous, finally lifted to meet his, and the world stopped. In them he saw it all, the shock, the fear, and beneath it the deep, unhealed wound he had carved into her soul. A part of him, The part that still remembered how to feel, recoiled in shame. But the rest of him, the part that had survived, that had clawed its way to the top of Soul's underworld, pushed forward. He reached David's chair. The man finally looked up, annoyance shifting to confusion, then to a raw animal fear as he registered the sheer finality in Jinwoo's expression. Jinwoo ignored him. His focus was entirely on Zola, on the slight tremor of her chin, the way her hand tightened around her wine glass. He pulled an empty chair from a nearby table, the legs scraping against the polished floor with a sound that was grotesquely loud in the suffocating silence. He placed it at the head of their small table, a king taking his throne. Then, and only then, did he look at the other man. His voice, when it came, was quiet, devoid of heat, yet it carried the chilling weight of an executioner's sentence. "Get out," he said, the words simple, absolute. "She's mine." The silence that followed Jinwoo's words was a living thing. It pressed in on Zola, stealing the air from her lungs, amplifying the frantic thumping in her ears. She saw David's face pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. He looked from Jinwoo's impassive, deadly calm face to her, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and pleading. He wanted her to do something, to say something, to fix this. But she was frozen, trapped in the gravitational pull of the man who had ripped her life apart and now stood there as if he had the right to claim the pieces. Her own voice felt like a stranger in her throat when she finally found it. "What did you say?" The question was a whisper, but it sliced through the quiet. Jinwoo's dark eyes shifted from David, finally settling on her fully. The intensity of his gaze was a physical force, pinning her to her seat. He didn't answer her question. He didn't need to. He simply held her gaze, and in that look, 5 years of pain, of unanswered questions, of lonely nights spent wondering, came rushing back. The carefully constructed walls of her new life crumbled to dust in a single, silent moment. Anger, hot and sharp, finally burned through the shock. "Who in the hell do you think you are?" Her voice was stronger now, laced with the bitterness she had swallowed for half a decade. David, seeing his moment, fumbled with his wallet, throwing some bills onto the table. I should go," he stammered, not looking at either of them. He practically scrambled out of his chair, nearly tripping in his haste to escape the suffocating tension. He was gone, a ghost, and she was alone with the one man she had sworn she would never see again. The space he had occupied was now a gaping hole, filled only by Jinwoo's overwhelming presence. He sat down in the chair he had brought, the movement economical and precise. He didn't speak, he just watched her, his hands resting on the table, still and powerful. Zola's own hands were trembling under the table, clenched into fists so tight her nails bit into her palms. The physical space between them was only a few feet of polished wood, but it felt like a chasm filled with wreckage. "You have no right," she said, her voice shaking with repressed fury. "You have no right to be here. You have no right to say that." Jinwoo watched the lesser man flee, a flicker of contempt passing through him before it was extinguished. The man didn't matter. He had never mattered. There was only Zola, her face a mask of fury and hurt, her beautiful eyes flashing with the fire he remembered so well. He had missed that fire. He had missed it more than he had missed the sun. He absorbed her words, her anger. He deserved it. He deserved more. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind 1,000 times, played out 100 different scenarios, but none of them had prepared him for the reality of her pain, so raw and immediate it was like an open wound between them. His own instincts screamed at him to command, to control the situation as he did every other aspect of his life. But he had learned the hard way that control was what had broken them in the first place. My choice. My mistake. The words echoed in the silent chambers of his mind, a mantra of his regret. He had chosen to leave her, believing he was protecting her from the poison of his world. He had convinced himself that a clean break, however brutal, was a kindness. He saw now the arrogance in that belief. He had denied her a voice, a choice of her own, and in doing so, had inflicted a wound far deeper than any enemy's blade. He kept his expression impassive, a habit born of necessity, but inside a storm raged. He wanted to reach across the table, to touch her face, to erase the last 5 years with a single, impossible gesture. He remembered the first time he had seen her, in a small art gallery in Itaewon. She had been staring at a painting, her expression so open, so full of genuine wonder, that he had felt something shift inside him, a tectonic plate moving for the first time. She had turned and caught him watching, and instead of looking away, she had smiled. A brilliant, fearless smile that had lit up the entire room and made him, for one insane moment, believe he could be a different man. That memory was a sharp, sweet ache in his chest. He let the silence stretch, allowing her anger its space to breathe. Then he spoke her name, just her name, the syllables feeling both foreign and sacred on his tongue. Zola. The sound of her name in his voice, that deep, quiet timbre she hadn't heard in 5 years, was a key turning in a lock she thought she had thrown away. It bypassed the anger and struck something deeper, something vulnerable and terrified. A memory, sharp and unwanted, flooded her mind. It wasn't a happy one. It was the last one. The night he left. Flashback. The air in their shared apartment had been cold, despite the summer heat. He stood by the door, a packed bag at his feet. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the wall just past her shoulder, his face carved from stone. "I'm leaving," he had said. Not, "we have to talk." Not, "I'm sorry." Just a statement of fact, as clinical as a weather report. She had felt the floor drop out from under her. "What are you talking about? Leaving? Where are you going?" Her questions had been frantic, desperate pleas for an explanation that made sense. He finally met her eyes, and the coldness in them had frozen her blood. "It's over, Zola. It was a mistake. A mistake." 2 years of her life, of loving him with an intensity that had frightened her, of believing she was the one person who saw the man behind the impenetrable walls. All of it a mistake. She had begged, she had cried, she had demanded answers. He had given her nothing but silence and a final, dismissive glance before he walked out the door, closing it softly behind him. The sound of that soft click had been the most violent sound she had ever heard. Present. "Don't," she breathed, the word ragged. "Don't you dare say my name like you still have any right to it." She pushed her chair back, the legs scraping harshly. The meal was forgotten, the wine, the entire world outside of this suffocating bubble of the past. 5 years, Jinu. Not a single word, not a letter, not a call. You vanished. And now you show up, you chase away my date, and you sit there saying my name? The questions poured out of her now, a torrent of pain held back for too long. What do you want? Why are you here? Did you get bored of whatever life you ran off to and decide to come back and ruin this one too? She stood, her body trembling, ready to flee. This was too much. She couldn't breathe. He had to be stopped. He had to be gone. He finally moved, not to block her, but to look up at her, his face for the first time showing a crack in its marble facade. A flicker of something raw, something desperate. "I kept the note," he said, his voice low. Her blood ran cold. The note. The single piece of paper she had left on the empty bed the next morning. It had only held 3 words. Jinwoo saw the panic and fury in her eyes as she stood to leave, and a cold dread seized him. He couldn't let her go. Not again. Not when he had just found her. All his power, all his influence, was useless if she walked out that door. He had to give her a reason to stay. an anchor in the storm of her anger. The note. He had kept it in his wallet for 5 years, a folded, worn piece of paper that was both a penance and a prayer. Her 3 words had haunted his every waking moment and stalked his dreams. You broke me. He had read them 1,000 times, the ink slightly blurred as if from a single fallen tear. Each time they were a fresh indictment. I kept the note, he repeated, holding her gaze, willing her to understand the weight of that admission. For a man like him, who kept nothing of the past, this was a confession. It was proof that while he had left her, she had never, for a single second, left him. He saw the shock register on her face, saw the way her body froze mid-flight. He had her attention, now for the truth. Or part of it, the part she could handle. It was the only way, he said, the words feeling clumsy, inadequate, to keep you safe. He watched her process this, saw the immediate, cynical disbelief cloud her features. It was a cliché, the kind of line a man like him would use. He knew how it sounded. But it was also the truth. 5 years ago, his rivals had learned of her existence. They had seen her as a weakness, a pressure point to be exploited. A photograph had been left on his car. Zola, laughing as she walked out of a bookstore, completely unaware of the lens, of the danger. The threat was unspoken, but clear. We know where to find her. His decision had been immediate and absolute. To protect her, he had to become a ghost in her life. He had to erase himself so completely that no one would ever associate her with him again. He had to break her heart to save her life. How could he explain that to her now without it sounding like a self-serving excuse? He couldn't. He could only try. There were things, people, they knew about you. He kept his voice steady, his gaze direct. This was not the time for emotion. This was the time for facts, however few he could give. He reached into his suit jacket, his movements slow, deliberate, so as not to startle her. He didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out his wallet, old, worn leather. He opened it and carefully extracted the small, folded square of paper. He didn't open it. He simply placed it on the table between them, a fragile, damning piece of their shared history. Zola stared at the small, folded piece of paper on the table. Her note, the last word she had ever intended for him to have, now sitting between them like a ghost at the feast. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, wild thing. His words echoed in her ears. To keep you safe. Safe from what? Safe from whom? A part of her, the small, hopeful part she thought had died 5 years ago, wanted to believe him. It wanted to grab onto that flimsy justification and let it soothe the jagged edges of her pain. But the rest of her, the woman who had spent 5 years putting herself back together, piece by agonizing piece, was screaming. It was too easy, too neat, a convenient excuse for an act of breathtaking cruelty. Safe? The word was incredulous, sharp with disbelief. You thought breaking my heart, disappearing without a trace, and leaving me to think I was nothing more than a mistake was keeping me safe? She shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. It was a hollow, ugly sound. Safe from what, Jinwoo? Tell me. What terrible danger was I in that only your complete and total abandonment could fix? She leaned forward, placing her palms flat on the table, challenging him. The power dynamic had shifted again. He had offered an explanation, and now she was its judge and jury. She wasn't the crying, begging girl he had left behind in that apartment. She was a woman who had survived him. She had built a life, a career. She had friends. She had gone on boring, safe dates with nice men. She had done everything she was supposed to do to move on. And here he was, trying to rewrite the narrative of their ending, recasting himself as the tragic hero instead of the villain who had shattered her world. "You don't get to do that," she said, her voice dropping, becoming dangerously quiet. "You don't get to come back 5 years later and dress up your cruelty as some kind of noble sacrifice. I lived through the aftermath of what you did. I know what it felt like, and it didn't feel like protection." She held his gaze, refusing to back down. The questions hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. He had opened the door to the past, and she was going to march through it and demand a reckoning. Jinwoo held her gaze, absorbing the full force of her disbelief, her righteous anger. Every word she spoke was true. He had been cruel. He had been a coward. He had chosen the simplest, most brutal path, and she had paid the price for it. He didn't look away, didn't flinch. He owed her this, at least, to sit and take the judgment he had long since passed on himself. The quiet restaurant, the other diners now trying to pretend they weren't watching the drama unfold, it all faded away. There was only Zola, her face illuminated by the low light, her eyes bright with unshed tears and fury. He had no easy answers for her. How could he explain the chilling finality of seeing that photograph? The cold certainty that his enemies, men with no honor, would not hesitate to use her to destroy him. Telling her the details would only put her in danger again, painting a target on her back. He was trapped between his need to protect her and his desperate, selfish need for her to understand. "I know," he said. The 2 words were all he had, an admission of guilt, an acknowledgement of her pain. He knew what it felt like. He knew what he had done. He was not here to excuse it, only, perhaps, to explain it. He looked out the window for a moment, at the rain-streaked city lights, a world he commanded, a kingdom of shadows and fear. He could have a man killed with a single nod. He could make fortunes rise and fall with a phone call. But he couldn't find the right words to convince the only woman he had ever loved to give him 5 more minutes of her time. A flicker of something that felt like humor, but was too bleak to be funny, passed through him. The great Jinwoo Kwon, undone by a conversation. He turned his gaze back to her. "I cannot explain it here," he said, his voice low and even. "Not in this place." It was a risk, a huge one. He was asking for more time, more proximity. He was asking for a sliver of trust he had not earned. His internal monologue was a plea. "Please, Zola, don't walk away again." "Come with me," he said. It wasn't a command, it was a request. Perhaps the first real request he had ever made of her. "Somewhere private. I will tell you everything you want to know. Then, if you still want me to leave, I will disappear. You will never see me again. I swear it." The choice. It hung in the air between them, as real and as solid as the table. Come with me. It was an insane proposition. To leave with the man who was the source of her deepest trauma. To willingly place herself back into his orbit based on a cryptic promise. Every rational part of her brain screamed no. It screamed for her to turn, to walk out of this restaurant, get in a cab, go home to her safe beige apartment, and lock the door. She could forget this ever happened. She could go on another date with another nice man. She could continue living the life she had so carefully constructed. But it would be a lie. The questions Jinwoo had just ripped open would fester. The mystery of his departure, which she had buried under years of anger, was now unearthed and demanding to be solved. What danger? What people? Why? The what-ifs would haunt her far more than the memory of this disastrous dinner. She looked at him, truly looked at him, not as the ghost who haunted her memories, but as the man sitting before her. The severe lines of his face seemed deeper. The usual ironclad control he held over himself seemed frayed at the edges. There was a weariness in his eyes she had never seen before, a subtle desperation beneath the calm exterior. He wasn't the same man who had left her. That man had been cold, certain, and untouchable. This man was asking. He was vulnerable, in his own tightly controlled way. A different memory surfaced, unbidden, a memory from before the end. They were at a street market late at night, the air thick with the smell of sizzling food and spices. He had won a small, cheap stuffed animal for her at a rigged game, his usual seriousness replaced by a rare, breathtaking smile as he handed it to her. In that moment, he hadn't been a powerful, feared man. He had just been a man in love. That was the man she had mourned. Was any piece of that man left? Could she risk finding out? Her internal battle was titanic, a war between self-preservation and the desperate need for closure. After 5 years of unanswered questions, the truth felt like a necessity, like air. She let out a slow, shaky breath. The anger was still there, a hot coal in her chest, but beneath it, a sliver of something else had taken root, curiosity, and a terrifying, treacherous flicker of hope. She gave a single, sharp nod. Fine. The word was a surrender and a declaration all at once. It was not forgiveness. It was an armistice. The single word, fine, struck Jinwoo with the force of a physical blow. It was not absolution. It was not forgiveness. But it was a stay of execution. It was a chance. A wave of relief, so profound it almost buckled him, washed through his system. He had been so certain she would say no, that she would walk away and leave him sitting in the ruins of his own making. For a moment, he felt the control he maintained with such ruthless discipline threaten to splinter. He wanted to close his eyes, to breathe, to savor the fragile victory. Instead, he forced his features to remain neutral, giving her only a slow, deliberate nod in return. He couldn't let her see how desperately he needed this, how her one-word concession had felt like being pulled from a deep, cold ocean. He stood, his movements fluid and measured, the leader once more. But this time, it was different. When he pushed his chair in, he didn't immediately turn to leave. He waited. He watched as Zola rose, her movements still laced with a tense uncertainty. He didn't lead the way out. He waited for her to take the first step, falling into place just behind her, a silent guardian rather than a captor. He placed enough money on the table to cover their meal and the entire restaurants for the rest of the night, a silent apology for the scene he had caused. Outside, the city air was cool and damp with rain. The sounds of traffic and life rushed back in, a stark contrast to the suffocating silence of the restaurant. His car, a sleek black sedan with tinted windows, was waiting at the curb, his driver standing impassively by the door. But Jinwoo didn't let the driver open the door for her. He did it himself. It was a small gesture, perhaps insignificant to anyone else, but for them, in the context of their history, it was a seismic shift. He had never done that before. In their past life, doors were simply opened for them. He had moved through the world with an assumption of service. This was an act of intention, an act of respect. He watched as she slid into the plush leather seat, then closed the door gently behind her, before walking around to the other side. The space inside the car felt both vast and claustrophobic. The scent of leather and his subtle, expensive cologne filled the air, a scent that was painfully familiar. He sat beside her, the physical distance between them a stark metaphor for the emotional chasm they had yet to cross. The journey ahead was uncertain, fraught with the ghosts of their past. But for the first time in 5 years, they were on that road together. Jinwoo rested his hand on the center console, his fingers inches from hers, a bridge not yet crossed. The car pulled silently into the stream of city lights, heading into the unknown darkness. The silence in the car was a weapon. It was thick and heavy, pressing in on Zola from all sides, making it hard to breathe. Her own heartbeat was a frantic drum against the quiet hum of the engine. She stared out the window, watching the neon-slicked streets of the city blur into ribbons of color, but she saw none of it. Her awareness was entirely focused on the man beside her. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, sense the coiled stillness in his posture. He hadn't said a word since they'd gotten in, his profile a rigid silhouette against the passing lights. This was his way. The silence was his domain, a place where he was in absolute control. In the past, she had found a strange comfort in it, a calm in his quiet strength. Now it felt like a cage. Her mind, a traitor, conjured a memory. A different car, a different night. They were driving out of the city, the summer air warm through the open windows. A song she loved was playing softly on the radio, and she was singing along, badly. He had glanced at her, and the corner of his mouth had lifted in that rare, devastating smile. He hadn't said anything, but he had reached over and taken her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it in time with the music. It was a perfect, simple moment of such profound peace that it made her chest ache to remember it now. The memory was a knife, twisting in the old wound. She had to break this silence before it consumed her. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Jin-woo didn't turn his head. He continued to look straight ahead, as if navigating the city required his complete and unwavering focus. For a long moment, she thought he would ignore her, another power play in a game she no longer wanted to play. But then he answered, his voice a low rumble in the enclosed space. "Somewhere I can't lie." The answer was cryptic, infuriating, and utterly him. It wasn't an address, it was a condition. It raised 1,000 more questions and answered none. Zola fell back against the soft leather, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a weary resignation. She had agreed to this. She had to see it through. The car finally turned, leaving the main thoroughfare and ascending a quiet, private road that snaked up a hillside overlooking the city. She didn't recognize it. This wasn't a part of their past. The car slowed and pulled through a set of imposing iron gates, stopping before a building of steel and glass that seemed to hang over the cliff's edge. It was magnificent, imposing, and completely soulless. The driver got out and opened her door. Jin-woo was already standing on the pavement, waiting. The wind was stronger up here, whipping a strand of her hair across her face. He didn't move to touch it, but his eyes followed the motion, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. He led her towards the entrance, the silence between them now charged with a new kind of tension, anticipation. He was taking her to his home, a home she had never seen, a life she had never been a part of. The door opened not with a key, but with the press of his thumb against a scanner. Inside, the world was silent and vast. A 2-story wall of glass revealed a panoramic, breathtaking view of the city lights, glittering below like a fallen constellation. It was the kind of view that belonged in a magazine, beautiful and remote. It was the loneliest place she had ever seen. The penthouse was his fortress and his prison. Every object within it was chosen with precision. The minimalist Italian furniture, the abstract art on the walls, the single, perfect orchid on a polished chrome table. It was a testament to his success, his power, his impeccable taste, and it was utterly devoid of life. He watched Zola take it in, her eyes sweeping over the cold, clean lines of the space. He could almost hear her thoughts. This is what his life is now, empty. And she was right. He had built this monument to his loneliness, a place so sterile that no ghost from the past could ever find comfort here. But her presence, just by being in the room, shattered the illusion. Suddenly, the space wasn't just empty, it felt hollow, a vacuum that her warmth and vitality made painfully apparent. He felt a profound, unnerving sense of exposure, as if she could see straight through the expensive facade to the desolate man who lived within it. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the echoing space. "Can I get you something? Water? Wine?" The offer was a formality, a simple script to follow when one was so far off the map. He needed a moment, a task to perform to steady the tremor he felt deep inside. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She wasn't here for pleasantries. She turned from the window to face him, her arms crossed over her chest, a defensive posture that was like a shield against him, against the room, against the whole impossible situation. "You said you would tell me everything. Start talking." He gave a slow nod. He deserved her impatience. He walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, not to admire the view, but to put a slight distance between them. It was easier to speak the truth when he wasn't drowning in the accusation in her eyes. He began, not with the danger, but with himself. "You were right," he started, his gaze fixed on the distant, glittering city. "In the restaurant, when you said I was cruel, it was a cruelty I chose. I convinced myself it was a kindness, that a clean cut would be better for you than a slow poison." He paused, the words feeling like shards of glass in his throat. "That was my first mistake. It was arrogant. I made a choice for you, without you. I didn't respect you enough to believe you were strong enough to make it with me." This was the hardest part, admitting his own failure, his own fear. It was anathema to the man he had built himself to be. "I was a coward." He finally turned to look at her, forcing himself to meet her gaze. The mask was off. "I was terrified of what they would do to you, but I was also terrified of what I would become if anything happened to you. So I cut you out, like a surgeon removing a tumor, only I removed my own heart instead." Zola listened, her body rigid. Each word he spoke landed like a carefully placed stone, building a bridge back to a past she had tried to demolish. "I was a coward." The confession hung in the air, a stunning, unexpected admission. She had been prepared for excuses, for justifications, for the kind of convoluted logic that powerful men use to absolve themselves. She had not been prepared for this raw, unvarnished self-indictment. It disarmed her. The anger that had been her armor for 5 years began to feel heavy, ill-fitting. She watched him, standing against the glittering backdrop of a city he likely owned a piece of, looking more lost than she had ever seen him. The vast empty apartment was no longer just a display of wealth. It was a confession in itself. It was the physical manifestation of a life lived without joy, without warmth, without her. Still, the years of pain were not so easily erased. "Terrified of what?" she pressed, her voice softer now, but still insistent. The core of the question remained. Who were they? What was this great danger that required such a brutal solution? He held her gaze for a long moment before walking over to a sleek black desk. He touched a panel, and a hidden drawer slid open with a soft hiss. From it, he removed a thin manila file. He didn't hand it to her. He placed it on the large marble coffee table that separated them, a silent offering. Her legs felt unsteady as she moved towards it, drawn by a force she couldn't resist. She sat on the edge of the cold leather sofa and reached for the file, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside, there was only one thing, a photograph. It was her. She was walking out of a small bakery near her old apartment, a bag of pastries in one hand, laughing at something just out of frame. The sun was in her hair. She looked young, carefree, and completely, blissfully unaware. It was a candid, stolen moment. But it wasn't the image of herself that made the blood drain from her face. It was the small, red circle drawn crudely around her head, like a sniper's target. The message was unmistakable. We can get to her whenever we want. Suddenly, the vague threat he spoke of became terrifyingly real. It wasn't an excuse. It was a photograph that had signed her death warrant, or at least, the death warrant for their relationship. She looked up from the picture to his face. For the first time, she saw the truth of the last 5 years, not through the lens of her own heartbreak, but through the horror of his choice. He hadn't just left her. He had been running from this. He had been protecting her from a world she never even knew was watching. The anger inside her didn't just recede, it evaporated, leaving behind a vast, hollow space filled with a dizzying, complicated sorrow. Jinwoo watched her absorb the photograph. He saw the precise moment the truth landed, the subtle widening of her eyes, the sharp intake of breath, the way the color drained from her face. He saw the anger dissolve and be replaced by the shock of understanding. He had braced himself for her continued disbelief, for more accusations. He hadn't been prepared for the wave of silent, shared grief that now filled the room. The photograph was a vulgar, brutal thing, but it was the only proof he had. It was the reason for every sleepless night, every cold transaction, every violent act he had committed in the intervening years, to consolidate his power, to build walls so high that no one would ever be able to touch anyone he cared about again. He had eliminated the threat, methodically and permanently, but the paranoia had remained, a constant, low hum beneath the surface of his life. He finally moved, breaking the spell. He walked around the coffee table and sat not next to her, but on the ottoman across from her, closing the distance, but still giving her space. He was close enough to see the shimmer of tears in her eyes, close enough to feel the tremor in her hands as she placed the photograph back in the file. He reached out, his own hand hesitant, and gently covered her hand where it rested on the file. His touch was tentative, a question. When she didn't pull away, his fingers curled slightly, a whisper of contact that sent a jolt through them both. "There were others," he said, his voice barely audible. "Threats. This was just the one that made it real. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. Every time my phone rang, I thought it would be them. Every time you were 5 minutes late coming home, I imagined the worst." He was confessing the depth of his fear, stripping away the final layer of his carefully constructed persona. "My mistake," he continued, his thumb now stroking the back of her hand, a ghost of a gesture from a forgotten memory, "was not the leaving. The danger was real. My mistake was in how I left. I should have told you. I should have trusted you. We could have run, we could have fought, we could have made the choice together. But I took that from you. I made myself your judge and your executioner, because I thought I knew best. That is the thing I can never forgive myself for." He looked at their joined hands. Her skin was so warm, he had forgotten the feeling. "It was 5 years of silence," he whispered, the confession raw and painful. 5 years of waking up in a place like this, with everything I ever thought I wanted, and feeling nothing. Every day, Zola, every single day, I regretted the choice I made. Not because it was wrong to protect you, but because it cost me you." Zola felt his touch, a spark on her cold skin. It wasn't the touch of a powerful man claiming what was his. It was the tentative, questioning touch of someone reaching across a vast and broken distance, hoping to find purchase on the other side. His words, his confession of fear and regret, washed over her, dismantling the last of her defenses. He wasn't rewriting their history to make himself the hero. He was admitting that he had been a flawed, terrified man who had made a terrible human mistake. The photograph on the table was proof of the danger, but his confession was proof of his love. A love so fierce and protective that it had compelled him to destroy the very thing he was trying to save. A profound, aching sadness settled over her, a grief for the two people they had been, for the 5 years they had lost to fear and silence. Tears she had refused to shed for half a decade finally welled in her eyes, hot and unstoppable. They weren't tears of anger anymore, or even of heartbreak. They were tears of understanding, of loss, of a deeply buried love that was, she now realized with a terrifying certainty, not dead at all. It had simply been dormant, waiting. One tear escaped, tracing a silent path down her cheek. Jinwoo saw it, and his expression crumpled with a pain that mirrored her own. He made no move to wipe it away. He simply watched, his own eyes glistening, accepting her tears as another part of his penance. She slowly pulled her hand from under his, and for a heart-stopping moment, he thought she was retreating again. But she didn't pull back. She lifted her hand, her fingers trembling, and reached for his face. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then gently laid her palm against the hard line of his jaw. His skin was warm beneath her touch. He flinched, almost imperceptibly, as if unused to a gentle human contact. Then he leaned into her hand, his eyes closing, a shudder passing through his powerful frame. It was a surrender. In that single, silent gesture, 5 years of pain, anger, and misunderstanding collapsed. The chasm between them was gone. There was only the quiet hum of the city below, the soft touch of her hand on his skin, and the shared, ragged breathing of two people finding their way back to each other in the dark. She said his name, just a whisper, Jinwoo. He opened his eyes, and the darkness and control were gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability that stole her breath. He lifted his own hand to cover hers, holding it against his face. "I'm sorry," he breathed, the words not an excuse, but a prayer. For everything. The past was not erased, but for the first time, it felt like something they could survive together. The healing had begun.